Thanks for having me. And I'm excited to talk to you about remote work today. But, part of remote work and doing it right is knowing when you have to step away. And I know there's a lot going on in the world right now, so I appreciate you being here, but I also understand if you need to disconnect. But while we're here, I'm going to be happy to talk to you about, how to do remote right. And as Natalie said, my name's Brendan. I've been at GitLab for the past 3.5 years. And I actually spoke here last year about going suddenly remote because GitLab has been remote since its founding in 2014. And so it's something that we were kind of used to when the whole rest of the world, had to suddenly go remote with the pandemic. And so that was a time where we were trying to, help with resources and talk as much as we could about what it looks like to go remote and what it looks like to go remote suddenly. But now, we're really in this, I would call it a post-office world. Many of us are seeing, the light at the end of the tunnel or the light that I would say that we had already seen. And so I want to talk about how we can thrive as individual contributors, as managers, as leadership in this post-office world. And like Natalie said, as we go, if you have questions, that'd be great. We should also have time at the end for questions, but feel free to raise your hand and we can go from there. So, as I mentioned, GitLab is and was one of the world's largest remote organizations. So we have 1,300 team members in 65 or more countries and regions with hundreds of thousands of organizations. And beyond just our full-time employees, we've had, over 3,000 individuals who contribute to the open source version of GitLab. And of course, they're all working remotely as well, right? And so we don't have an office for those team members, and we never have really. And one of the things that drew me to GitLab is the way we talk about our company and the culture. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later in the talk. But suffice it to say that our leadership has made a huge investment in creating a strong culture, and it's really paid off. So here's just 3 ways that we were recognized in 2020 for, essentially having happy employees. Everyone I know that works at GitLab is happy to be there. And I think that's reflected in these kinds of awards. Even before the pandemic, we saw this kind of need for organized thinking around the future of work. And we created an all-remote team. And that team exists to help understand remote work for GitLab and for others, to help kind of codify what are the best practices around that and try to predict what the future would look like. Again, at the time before the pandemic, we thought that remote work was the future, and now we kind of know that it is. And to date, this all-remote team has been very effective. They have strategies that are now being taught at Harvard Business School, for instance. And personally, GitLab is my first remote job, but it's not the first time I've worked with remote teams. So I've always had global team members, but before GitLab was always in an office. And so when I joined in 2017, it was the first time that I went remote. And my focus has been kind of changing over that time. When I started, we were only 150 people. And like I said, we've grown to 1,300. I spent time in our professional services organization. I spent time in our product organization, and now I get to spend time talking to all of you as an evangelist for GitLab. And in February, March of 2020, all of a sudden we were joined by other remote companies and hundreds of millions of, not billions of other people who were all suddenly learning how to work, outside an office and on some scale that, we've never seen in human history. I go back to Arthur C. Clarke actually was the one who really predicted remote work. I can't say that GitLab can take credit for that. In a 1978 interview, he was interviewed by a journalist who had his young son with him there. And he said, "Oh, your son will he'll connect to a computer through a network of other computers, and he'll do his work from anywhere in the world, and he won't need to go into a city or an office. And so we were slowly from, that time till the real invention of the internet that, Arthur C. Clarke basically predicts there. Through 2020, we're slowly seeing that happen. But then, we were hit with this huge transformation and this big experiment where more and more major companies are deciding, hey, we're going to continue to work remotely, even after the pandemic is over. And what we're hearing now is like this global conversation about what does returning to work look like? How much future work will happen in an office or not in an office? And before the pandemic, these are some stats that we had found and gathered. These are from some GitLab reports and other reports from other organizations. And at the time, we were trying to convince the world that it was the future of work. And so when we talked to people, we found those who were already working remotely, we found interesting results, right? Those folks said that, look, we think this is the future of remote work. I would change for an all remote job. And then COVID has, as we've seen this global remote work experience, we're seeing other things happen. We're seeing this kind of like rubber band effect where we're seeing people work more often, more people working on the weekends, huge amounts of burnout. 63% are discouraged from taking time off, right? This is really concerning to me, and I think to all of us, because it's not truly remote work. It's this crisis-induced working from home. And if you're feeling this stress on your teams, I think, clearly you're not alone. It's happening to everyone. And I think that reason is really obvious. We didn't have any time to execute this remote transition strategy. We've been just in crisis mode, and we can't do that forever. And the reason we can't do that forever is it won't scale. And this is a fun, I guess it's a meme from someone I follow on Twitter, Chloe Condon, which is whenever I want to say the word scale, I have to bring this in. Because it's not going to scale if we're not focused on what remote work should look like. So to kind of paint that picture, I want to paint a picture of like what it could be, right? What does it look like on a team that's implemented a strong remote work culture? So I got a little tally sheet out and I documented my day this past Monday, the 12th. And when this organization has a mature remote strategy, it can be a super positive experience. You can see here, I wasn't rushed. I worked a normal set of hours. I had lunch and saw my 3-year-old who's still at home, not at school. She's never known me to be in an office, which is a really interesting experience because I have older children who did know when I was in an office and understand the difference. And then my 3-year-old just expects that I'm here all the time because she doesn't remember before the pandemic when I traveled some, and she wasn't alive for a time that I went into an office. And so, these few things, a few meetings, trying to think, the coffee chat, the one-on-one, those are half-hour meetings, which are really 25-minute meetings. Our meetings are either 25 or 50 minutes to make sure that there's a gap between if you do have a back-to-back meeting. Very few emails you can see. We'll talk about that later as we talk about asynchronous work. But a lot of work in GitLab issues and in shared documents, all from the office you see here in Maryland. And so I think that's, this all remote, right? That's I think the definition of truly mature remote team. But as we've been thinking about how do we talk to folks who are getting back to, what does work look like when we come out of the pandemic, we've kind of identified 5 main types of teams on this kind of continuum, right? I think no remote and all remote are pretty self-explanatory, but I think most teams either today fall or will fall in these middle 3, right? I think remote is allowed as how, there was a good number of teams that were like that before the pandemic. You have an office, most people work there every day, but some people choose to work from home some of the time. Remote first kind of flips that on the head. You have an office somewhere, but most people don't work there. Only some of the people come into the office some of the time. And in the middle, you have this concept of hybrid remote. This is a very popular option, and it's becoming more and more popular as we talk about going back, because it seems like the best of both worlds. You have an office. Some people work in the office most of the time, but you also have people who mostly work remotely, maybe in more distant locations or specific roles. It seems really efficient on paper, but it's actually in reality extremely difficult, the most difficult of any of these to maintain. And why is that? Well, it's because people are being treated differently based on some, I don't want to say arbitrary, but almost arbitrary reason, right? Where they live exactly, what their role is. It's going to create and does create this kind of inequality. It creates two cultures, right? The in-office culture and the remote employee culture. And it can really actually hamper operations. So in the companies we've studied, we've seen those that were hybrid remote, those kind of initiatives fail more often than any of the others. And I think the key to understand is that there is this gradient. And it's always going to be in transition. Remote work is always in a transition, I think. Many started with one of those types of teams at the beginning of 2020 and had a different type in March and has a different plan for what it's going to look like at the end of 2021. That attitude towards remote work has changed a lot in the past year. And so what will happen by the end of this year? Well, I think even for an all-remote company like GitLab, we're constantly learning and iterating. It's new, right? Remote working is still relatively new, but we're learning by doing. And so I think your team also needs to learn by doing and be intentional as you explore how remote work can serve your needs and how your team has to work together. And so I want to look at a few practical things that you can do to help build stronger teams remotely. One, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is meetings, right? I think this is the number one topic I get questions about. This is the one that I get questions about people that don't even work in anything related to me. I could tell you a story sometime of how I taught my mom, who works at a private school in Maryland, how to run meetings like we do. But right, everybody knows about meetings. It's an important part of learning to work remotely well is actually learning how to do meetings well. And well, why is that? I think there's a couple of reasons. First, we like to talk to each other, right? We're human, we're social beings. And so sometimes we just call it a meeting because it's going to be fun to talk face to face. Of course, that can multiply quickly and really quickly not be fun anymore. And second, I think we create meetings because we don't know how, or we don't trust how we can figure out things asynchronously. And sometimes that's valid. A lot of things might take synchronous talk. Like if you're brainstorming or you've got a difficult conversation to figure out. But most of the time, we're just defaulting to old habits. And it's okay to not have a meeting if you can build that trust. And how you build that trust is a couple of ways. One is, most companies have a lot of tools. They have a project management system, a chat tool, somehow to communicate, a document library, a digital asset library, but don't have a centrally located up-to-date handbook. And GitLab is the exact opposite here. And, we maintain this handbook that if you printed it out would be over 8,000 pages, each of which is updated constantly by the entire team. And it's a single source of truth for all of our essential operations. It's how our teams function, documented exactly how they function. And when you need to know how to do something in an office, it's easy. You just pop your head over someone's desk and say, hey, how do I work the copier, or how do I get a requisition form for this? But that doesn't work when you've got a team that's globally distributed. And I think we have a team member, I did the math one day, in almost every time zone. And so every question that happens is a delay. And every conversation takes longer. And that's a huge contributor to the burnout we've seen. And you might not have a handbook now, and 8,000 pages may sound daunting, and it is. Luckily, it's public and thus indexed by fantastic search engines, and that's how I get at it. But the key is to start. You just have to start, right? Start documenting your processes now in a central location, and then you have somewhere to keep it up to date. And once you commit to that, it becomes easier, right? As you have this living document. And then one of the hardest works, I think, hardest habits to break or hardest things to get right in remote is how do you separate work and chat, work and relationships, right? We've got these chat tools, and again, we're leaning heavily on them. They have notifications. They're designed to get you to respond quickly. So by nature, they're synchronous. They're not asynchronous. And it's tempting to use that for work. But again, that's basically just like a meeting then, right? It's synchronous. And if you have it on all day, then it's, an all day meeting. And the biggest problem is it doesn't create an artifact, right? There's nothing that comes out of that you can easily then reference as to what was the old discussion, what were the decisions made. And it doesn't support that asynchronous work that's required. And that doesn't mean that you can't work in the chat tool. This says don't work in your chat tool, which I think that should be your goal. But you should use chat for the things it's good at, right? Just like you would use a meeting for the things it's good at. A helpful forcing function here is we say that Slack is informal communication. We mean it because our Slack messages disappear after 90 days, right? So if you have something you have to document, it can't be in Slack. And we also, this is where we form community. So I've got examples here. I'm actually allergic to dogs, but who doesn't love a good dog picture? And in fact, it's a great way to experience dogs when you're allergic is through the internet. And so there's a dog channel. We used to have a bunch of different maker channels like woodworking and a couple different things, but now we just have I made this for all the makers at GitLab that made things and to come together and show them off. And then my favorite channel, having 4 small children, is the In the Parenthood channel, which is just, parents coming together and talking about the problems that they're all facing. And, it's just this kind of community building that really makes it special. And so I wouldn't get rid of my chat tool, but, the things I like about it aren't the work-related things. And so I think the question we hear from people about that is, but how do we know our employees are working? And to that, I would ask, why do you want to know how many hours your employees are working? Wouldn't you rather know what they're accomplishing and what their objective is and if they're hitting that goal? So building trust in remote work goes both ways. You have to empower your teams by letting them set their own hours, but you also have to give them clear, transparent goals and metrics so that work can be measured not by whether you attended or not by whether I saw your car in the parking lot before mine or not, but whether you were effective. And a big challenge here in remote work for the individual contributor can be loneliness, right? People can miss this time, having time to socialize and network and see each other in the office. And so as leaders, you have to make sure you're structuring informal communication, right? So GitLab, we have this thing called informal coffee chats, 25 minutes, 2 people to talk about anything but work. And honestly, I feel like a better employee when I'm doing more of that. And if I've got a week where I don't have any coffee chats because I'm too busy, it's such a key part of our culture that I understand actually, no, that was bad, right? That I was too busy with work to not have a coffee chat. And encourage people to bring, their full selves to work, right? Create those chat channels for discussing hobbies. And we have ones for cities people live in, right? Loc _ and name a city in the world. And we probably have that channel. Or for sharing skills, right? There's lots of things that those channels can be. And finally, be open with your team about the challenges you're having, what the successes are, and what the ideals are in creating a remote culture. Ask for feedback, share those values that drive your organization, and that's going to really help. This is just some other examples of ways we've stayed connected before. We've done, virtual trivia. We had juice box chats, which was an early pandemic creation when all of our kids were at home, for the kids to meet and play and meet each other. And, you also have to meet in person, right? You have to, we have regularly scheduled retreats. It didn't happen in 2020. We're very hopeful that it'll happen this year. And, visiting people is important once we can do that safely. And I think, lastly, just a couple things is to establish a remote leadership team, right? You might need to move an executive team to remote work and understand how that team is going to work together. have people focused on making remote work for your organization. And then also roll with the changes, right? I think it's difficult for leaders and team members who are learning to admit you don't know what you're doing. And I think the key there is, went too far. The key there is defining your values. Because that way, when you're not sure what to do, you can rely on your values to make the right decision. And so these are GitLab's values. Every team has their own system. And the thing I always say is GitLab talks more about our values than any company I've ever been at. And so I think whether you're working remotely or in an office, it doesn't really matter. Learning how to work remotely is mostly logistics, but understanding the impact of your work, how it's valued, making sure you bring something positive into the world with it, that's how you're going to live by your values. And ultimately, that's what's going to matter. So if you're in a difficult position, don't worry, rely on your team, have trust, you'll find the answer. I'd also like to plug the fact that our fantastic remote team wrote a remote work playbook, which has a lot of really detailed things that you can do as leaders and individual contributors. So check that out. Also, there's a 10-hour Coursera course, which is completely free to anyone, called How to Manage a Remote Team. That's, goes into a lot of detail about what remote transition looks like and what leaders and managers need to be thinking of. And that's really what I wanted to share with you today.